Tomorrow morning, June 25, 2025, the state of Mississippi is set to execute a man whose death sentence has remained unresolved for almost 49 years, through decades of courtroom battles, shifting laws, and haunting questions about justice and time. At 79 years old, Richard Gerald Jordan will become the oldest person ever put to death in the state's history, and one of the longest-serving death row inmates in America. But beneath the headlines lies a story far more complex. A decorated Vietnam veteran turned cold-blooded killer, whose desperate act in 1976 led to the kidnapping and execution-style murder of a young wife and mother, Edwina Marter. This is the full story of Richard Gerald Jordan, from the battlefield to the courtroom, through decades in solitary confinement, and the final hours of a man whose fate was sealed long ago but delayed for nearly 50 years. To understand this better, let's go back to where it all began. Richard Gerald Jordan was born on May 25, 1946, in the quiet, pine-shadowed town of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, a place where summer days bled into humid evenings, where neighbors still waved from their porches, and where the steady hum of ordinary life lulled people into a sense of stability that rarely made the evening news. Raised just a few miles away in the small town of Petal, Jordan's early years were unremarkable by any dramatic measure. The son of working-class parents, he grew up in a home rooted in structure, Sunday school, and sweat-earned paychecks. The Jordan family, like many others in the post-war American South, believed in discipline, hard work, and community, and Richard, the youngest of several children, was known among teachers and neighbors for being quiet, respectful, and sometimes even painfully shy. There were no broken windows, no fights behind the schoolyard, no signs, at least not yet, that his name would one day be inked into the state's death ledger. Instead, his youth was filled with the ordinary, running barefoot through dusty yards, sharing hand-me-down toys, and enduring the rhythm of Southern poverty that taught boys early how to shoulder burdens without complaint. But as Richard crossed into his teenage years, the world outside Mississippi was beginning to shift. The war in Vietnam was gaining momentum, and with it came a draft that would soon reach into living rooms across the nation, pulling young men from football fields, classrooms, and factory shifts into a war they didn't choose and couldn't understand. At 22, Jordan received his draft notice. Without protest, he packed his few belongings and boarded a bus bound for basic training, leaving behind the only world he had ever known. What he stepped into was not just a war but a machine, loud, chaotic, and relentless. He served as a combat soldier in Vietnam during the height of the conflict, witnessing firsthand the brutal aftermath of jungle warfare, the twisted wreckage of roadside bombings, the empty stares of wounded children, and the unimaginable noise of firefights that lit up the night sky. Like many soldiers in his unit, he returned home not to parades or therapy, but to silence, internal and external. The government did not speak of the trauma these men carried. The VA hospitals were overwhelmed, understaffed, and ill-prepared to handle the flood of broken minds returning from Southeast Asia. Richard Jordan was among those who came back with invisible wounds, haunted by flashbacks, unnerved by loud sounds, and unable to reconnect with the everyday rhythm of civilian life. His family, once the anchor of his childhood, could only watch as the young man who had left with a uniform returned with a hollow stare and deepening isolation. And so, as the years crept forward, that quiet boy from Petal, Mississippi, who once played stickball in the street and nodded politely to his elders, began to unravel, piece by piece, in a society that had no name or space for what was happening inside his head. When Richard Jordan returned home from Vietnam, he was not the same man who had once stood in a Mississippi church pew as a boy with folded hands and polished shoes. He tried, at first, to resume a life that resembled normalcy, settling in Louisiana and taking whatever work he could find to support his growing family. For a time, he clocked in at a fertilizer plant, then later moved to labor-intensive shifts at the shipyard. The work was grueling, the hours long, and the paychecks just barely enough to scrape by. Bills piled up like the silence in his home. His marriage, once a source of stability, began to strain under the weight of unpaid rent, medical expenses, and the unspoken trauma that followed him like a shadow. His children saw less and less of their father, and when they did, they found a man withdrawn and distant, his thoughts often trapped elsewhere. Jordan's emotional state continued to fracture, pushed to its breaking point by a deepening sense of worthlessness and despair. He was a man who had served his country and come home to a life that now seemed to be disintegrating in slow motion, and no one, it seemed, was coming to help. By early January of 1976, with financial ruin closing in and his mental stability fraying, Richard Jordan made a decision that would destroy multiple lives. On January 12, he left his Louisiana home and drove across state lines to Gulfport, Mississippi. It was not a random trip. He had selected his destination carefully. With a plan coldly calculated in his mind, he arrived at the upscale suburban home of Charles and Edwina Marter. Posing as a worker from the local electric company, he approached the house under the guise of routine service. Edwina Marter, 35 years old, greeted him at the door, unsuspecting, kind, and polite. A devoted mother and the wife of a respected bank loan officer, she was a woman who embodied the stability Jordan had lost. What followed was a deliberate act that spoke of both desperation and control. Jordan forced his way into the home and abducted Edwina at gunpoint. Her children were not home, by sheer fate or horrific fortune. And within minutes, Jordan had driven her away from the suburban safety of her life to a secluded location deep within the DeSoto National Forest. The hours that followed are a blur of terror and finality. At some point, Edwina resisted, perhaps she pleaded, perhaps she tried to flee, but Jordan, armed and emotionally broken, responded with lethal force. He shot her at close range, execution style, leaving her lifeless body amid the tall trees and pine needles. But even after she was gone, the crime was not over. With chilling composure, Jordan returned to a payphone and called her husband, claiming his wife was alive and demanding a $25,000 ransom. It was a lie, a twisted final insult to a grieving family. His scheme unraveled quickly. The call was traced, the vehicle identified, and within 24 hours of the murder, Richard Jordan was arrested. In custody, the facade collapsed. He confessed to everything: the planning, the abduction, the murder, and the callous ransom demand. There was no justification, no claim of temporary insanity, no delusion of innocence. Just a quiet admission from a man whose long, slow descent into despair had finally culminated in a single irreversible act of violence. The boy from Petal, the soldier from Vietnam, the father from Louisiana, was now the confessed killer of a mother whose only mistake was answering her door. In 1976, just months after the murder of Edwina Marter, Richard Gerald Jordan stood before a Mississippi jury with the weight of overwhelming evidence pressing down on him. His own confession, the traced ransom call, and the cold, calculated steps that led to Edwina's final moments in the DeSoto National Forest. The verdict came swiftly. He was found guilty of capital murder, and the court imposed the ultimate punishment: death. At just 30 years old, Jordan was sentenced to die by execution, becoming one of Mississippi's earliest death row inmates following the reinstatement of the death penalty in the post-Furman era. But what followed would be one of the most convoluted and protracted legal sagas in American capital punishment history. The certainty of his sentence was short-lived. In 1977, just 1 year after his conviction, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down mandatory death sentences as unconstitutional, ruling that each defendant must be given the opportunity for individualized sentencing, a decision that would ripple through cases across the nation, including Jordan's. His original sentence was vacated, triggering a series of retrials and resentencing hearings that would stretch over decades. Each time Jordan returned to court, the outcome remained the same: guilty of capital murder and once again sentenced to death. But his defense attorneys began to adopt new strategies rooted not just in legal technicalities but in his deteriorating mental health. They argued that Jordan's combat service in Vietnam left him with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that had gone largely undiagnosed and untreated in the 1970s, and which, they claimed, played a pivotal role in his descent into criminal behavior. Despite these arguments, juries repeatedly upheld the death penalty, unmoved by psychological testimony and the lingering specter of war trauma. Then, in the early 1990s came a turning point. In an effort to bring closure to a case that had already consumed years of courtroom time and taxpayer dollars, Mississippi prosecutors offered Jordan a deal: plead guilty and accept a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, and in return forfeit all rights to future appeals. After intense deliberation, Jordan agreed. He signed the deal and was transferred off death row, his life spared under the strict condition that he would not challenge the sentence. But that agreement unraveled almost as quickly as it was forged. Within a few years, Jordan, citing procedural errors and constitutional violations, resumed his appeals. Prosecutors viewed the move as a betrayal, accusing him of violating the plea bargain. Courts were forced to reconsider the validity of the deal, and in 1998, after extensive litigation, Jordan was once again resentenced to death. This time the sentence stuck. As the years wore on, Jordan's legal team launched a new wave of appeals, focusing not only on his PTSD but also on allegations of prosecutorial vindictiveness, the fairness of the plea negotiations, and, perhaps most critically, the constitutionality of Mississippi's method of execution. They argued that the state's use of midazolam in its lethal injection protocol risked subjecting inmates to excruciating pain in violation of the Eighth Amendment. These appeals stretched into the 2000s and 2010s, each one raising broader questions about how the justice system treats mentally ill veterans, whether plea bargains can be trusted, and what it means for a man to spend decades under a sentence of death. And through it all, Richard Jordan remained locked in a 6-by-9-foot cell year after year, as his case bounced between courtrooms, his fate suspended not by doubt of guilt, but by the grinding machinery of American death penalty law. By the time Richard Gerald Jordan crossed into his fourth decade on death row, he had become a living relic of the American criminal justice system, a man whose days were no longer measured by time, but by motions filed, hearings scheduled, and court rulings awaited. For nearly 50 years, Jordan lived behind the towering walls of Mississippi State Penitentiary, also known as Parchman Farm, one of the oldest and most notorious prisons in the South. His cell, just 6 feet wide and 9 feet long, became his entire world. Isolated from the general prison population, he spent upward of 23 hours a day alone in solitary confinement, with little more than a concrete slab for a bed, a metal toilet, and the constant humming presence of fluorescent lights overhead. Meals were passed through a narrow slot in the door. Conversation was rare, human contact even rarer. Inmates in neighboring cells were often too broken, too angry, or too lost to offer much in the way of camaraderie. Over the years, Jordan saw dozens of his fellow inmates leave the row, not through pardons but through executions or death by natural causes. Each time an empty cell was cleaned and repopulated, the message was clear: the system would wait as long as it had to. Visits from his family dwindled as decades passed. Some relatives died. Others moved on. A few remained loyal, but the long drives, strict visitation rules, and emotional toll made even the most faithful hesitate. His contact with the outside world narrowed to a small circle. His attorneys, a few aging friends, and occasionally journalists or legal observers curious about the man who had, by now, become Mississippi's longest-serving death row inmate. Despite the physical and emotional isolation, Jordan continued to fight. His legal team filed appeal after appeal, challenging everything from jury selection bias to lethal injection protocols, from mental health evidence to procedural violations. There were moments of hope, brief stays of execution, reconsiderations by federal judges, hearings reopened, but each time the appeals were eventually denied. The sentence remained death. In the silence of his cell, Jordan wrote letters to attorneys, letters to reporters, letters to the court. He wrote about the war, about the years he couldn't remember, and the nights he couldn't forget. He wrote about regret, not just legal arguments but genuine remorse. In one letter, he described the murder of Edwina Marter as the singular tragedy that undid every shred of humanity I once carried. In another, he recalled lying awake night after night, replaying that day in 1976, convinced that no punishment, not even death, could truly balance the scale. He wrote about the guilt that followed him like a shadow and the torment of knowing that no apology, no appeal, no prayer could bring her back. Occasionally, excerpts from these letters were read aloud in court or included in filings, each sentence a window into a mind both fractured and reflective. Though few outside legal circles ever heard his voice, those who read his words saw something far more complex than a cold-blooded killer. They saw a man shaped by trauma, hardened by war, broken by guilt, and trapped inside a system that had long since stopped asking how he got there. For nearly 5 decades, Richard Jordan remained a prisoner of both the state and his own past, his life reduced to a series of legal footnotes and prison logs. And yet, through it all, he continued to speak, through carefully chosen words, handwritten appeals, and the heavy, quiet weight of a man who had outlived nearly everyone else on Mississippi's death row. Now, nearly 5 decades since he first entered Mississippi's death row, the clock is winding down on Richard Gerald Jordan's life. In October 2024, the final ruling was handed down. His last legal appeal, based on the constitutionality of Mississippi's lethal injection protocol, was denied by the courts. With no other options remaining, the Mississippi Supreme Court issued a death warrant. The date was set, Wednesday, June 25, 2025. And unless a last-minute intervention changes course, in just a matter of days Jordan, now 79 years old, will become the oldest person ever executed in the state's history. Inside Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman, preparations have already begun. Jordan has been moved to the final holding cell near the execution chamber, known as Unit 17, a place with cold concrete walls, constant surveillance, and the sound of footsteps echoing louder than any words. In this small cell, just feet from where the state intends to end his life, Jordan spends his final hours in isolation. There is no chaos, no fanfare. Only silence, paperwork, and the grim ritual that accompanies executions in America. His legal team, still working around the clock, has filed emergency motions with the federal courts, once again challenging the state's use of the sedative midazolam, arguing it may leave inmates conscious and in agony, unable to cry out while the paralytic agents take hold. The motions cite cases where prisoners gasped, seized, or appeared to suffer during the process. But despite these filings, courts have shown no indication they will step in. Time is running out. Unlike other states that allow a final meal of the inmate's choosing, Mississippi does not grant this tradition. Jordan will be served the standard prison menu the night before. No requests honored, no indulgence allowed. Whether he eats, whether he speaks, whether he prays, these details may never be made public unless witnesses choose to share them. On the morning of June 25, Richard Jordan will be offered the chance to make a final statement before the injection begins. If he does, it will likely echo the words he's written for years, letters in which he accepted responsibility for the murder of Edwina Marter, a 35-year-old mother whose life he ended in 1976. He has never denied what he did. In past filings, he referred to the crime as inexcusable and described his remorse as something he has carried every single day. Whether his final words will be a direct apology to the Marter family, a quiet prayer, or complete silence remains to be seen. Witnesses scheduled to attend include members of Edwina's family, now decades older, some of them possibly seeing justice fulfilled after half a lifetime. Others present will be members of the press, the warden, clergy, and legal observers. Once everyone is in position behind the viewing glass, prison staff will walk Jordan into the chamber. He will be secured to the gurney by the ankles and wrists. 4 lines will be inserted into his arms. The room will be still, the air heavy. At the warden's signal, the execution team will begin administering the lethal cocktail, midazolam first to sedate him, followed by rocuronium bromide to paralyze, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. Jordan's chest will rise and fall for the final time. A doctor, present for this sole purpose, will enter the chamber to check his vitals. And in that moment, if everything proceeds on schedule, Mississippi will declare Richard Gerald Jordan dead. And so, at precisely 7 a.m. on June 25, 2025, the longest-serving death row inmate in Mississippi, and one of the longest in the nation, will take his final breath. As the sun rises beyond the barbed wire at Parchman Prison, the story of Richard Gerald Jordan will close, not as a mystery, not as a question of guilt, but as a grim reminder that the American death penalty, though slow, still carries through its sentence, even after a lifetime has passed. Tomorrow, Mississippi will do what it has waited nearly half a century to do, carry out a sentence handed down in 1976. But as Richard Gerald Jordan prepares to take his final breath inside Parchman's death chamber, the questions his case leaves behind are far from settled. How long is too long to wait for justice? What do we do with the crimes of a man shaped by war, broken by trauma, but undeniably responsible for the death of an innocent woman? And after nearly 50 years, can an execution still deliver the closure so many hope for? We've walked through every chapter of this case, from a quiet Mississippi town, to the jungles of Vietnam, to the slow, grinding machinery of the death penalty system. Now we turn the story over to you. What do you think? Was justice finally served? Or did it come far too late to mean anything at all? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you stand. And if you want more in-depth true crime stories just like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. To the family of Edwina Marter, we remember her name. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.